You don't get to bring him home, Turner. That's not how it works." The officer's tone was clipped, almost mechanical, as if he'd recited the line too many times. "He's government property until discharge. After that, he's reassigned, or retired. You know the policy." Staff Sergeant Mason Turner stood in the sweltering air of the Kandahar base, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, trying to process what he'd just been told. Across the lot, a German shepherd sat in a transport cage, panting hard, unaware this would be his last hour with the man who had shared foxholes, convoys, and firefights with him. His name was Ringo. He wasn't just a dog. He was Mason's partner, his lifeline, his reason for making it home at all. That was 3 years ago, and now standing outside a gas station in rural Oklahoma. Mason saw him again, but he almost didn't recognize him. It was the sound that caught his attention. First, a low, wet cough. Not aggressive, just desperate. Mason turned, expecting to find a stray or a coyote, but what he saw stopped him cold. There, crouched beneath the dented back end of a dumpster, was a skeletal German shepherd, ribs like prison bars, fur patchy with mange, one eye cloudy, the other locked on Mason with something between fear and recognition. His tail didn't wag, he didn't move, but his ears perked just slightly, and Mason froze. "Ringo," he whispered. The dog's head tilted, then dropped, as if ashamed to be seen. Mason took a cautious step forward, heart pounding, mind racing. Through 1,000 what-ifs, he dropped to one knee, ignoring the filth of the lot, and gently reached out a hand. "It's me, buddy. It's Mason. You remember?" The shepherd let out a sound that wasn't quite a whimper. Then, slowly, painfully, he crawled out from under the metal, his legs shaking, breath ragged. When he was finally close enough, he did something that shattered Mason completely. He collapsed against him. No bark, no lick, just the soft weight of a dog too proud to ask for help but too broken to keep standing. People passed by without noticing. A man filled his tank and drove off. Someone laughed on a phone nearby. But for Mason, the world had narrowed to this one animal, this one moment, and he could feel that Ringo had been abandoned, not lost, not misplaced, discarded. Mason scooped him up, skin and bones and all, and carried him into the back seat of his truck. The vet was over 40 minutes away, but he didn't care. He drove like his life depended on it, glancing back every few seconds to make sure Ringo was still breathing. The clinic was quiet when they arrived. Mason burst through the doors, shouting for help. The receptionist jumped, then waved a tech forward. Within minutes, Ringo was on a table, hooked to fluids, vitals taken, blood drawn. Mason stood outside the exam room, fists pressed to his forehead. The vet came out 20 minutes later, glove stained, expression heavy. "He's malnourished, dehydrated, multiple untreated infections. We'll do everything we can, but I need you to be prepared. He's hanging on by a thread." Mason nodded slowly, eyes red. "Just ... keep him here. I'll take care of the bill. Do whatever it takes." The vet paused. "You know this dog?" Mason let out a bitter laugh. "He dragged me through a minefield when I got hit. He chewed through a locked door to stop a suicide bomber. I don't know where I'd be if it weren't for him." The vet's expression softened. "Then he's lucky to have found his way back to you, but luck had nothing to do with it." Mason spent the night in the parking lot, refusing to leave. He pulled out an old duffel from his truck, military issue, still stinking of sand and diesel, and unzipped the side pocket. Inside was a photo, crumpled from travel and time. Him and Ringo, both younger, both whole. A wide desert behind them and a future they hadn't yet lost. Now, Mason stared at the glass doors of the clinic, silently begging the universe for just one more chance. Just one. By morning, Mason hadn't moved from his truck. The windshield was fogged, the air stale, but he couldn't bring himself to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment in the desert when a blast had ripped through their convoy, when dust and blood painted the world red, and when, through the screaming in his ears, he'd felt Ringo tugging at his vest, dragging him away from the fire. It had been instinct, training, maybe even love. And now, years later, Mason had found the same dog left to die in an alley like garbage. The injustice of it seared through him like acid. At 7:14 a.m., the vet emerged from the clinic, coffee in hand. She spotted Mason, gave a tired nod, and, "Who walked over? He made it through the night," she said gently. "Barely. His body's weak, but his heart's still fighting." "That's rare." Mason exhaled for the first time in hours. "Can I see him?" She hesitated. He sedated. "But yeah, come on, inside." The clinic smelled of antiseptic and pine cleaner. Ringo lay on a heated mat, hooked up to fluids, his ribs visible beneath the thin drape of fur. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was steady, a little less labored than the night before. Mason approached slowly, crouched beside him, and reached out to stroke his side. He half expected a flinch or a groan. Instead, Ringo leaned into his touch with a barely audible sigh. "I'm sorry," Mason whispered. "I should have found you sooner." He didn't know where the words came from. He hadn't even known Ringo was missing. After his tours he'd requested to adopt him, but the request had been denied, reassigned to another handler, the report had said. Mason assumed Ringo had gone on to a safer, second life, a civilian retirement. He tried to forget, tried to move forward, but now, faced with the truth, he realized how badly the system had failed the only soul who had never failed him. Over the next several days, Mason returned to the clinic again and again. He slept in the truck, brought fresh blankets, helped clean wounds and administer food by hand. The staff grew used to his presence. One even admitted she'd never seen a dog respond so calmly to a stranger's touch. "He's not a stranger," Mason corrected. "He's my brother." The vet, Dr. Cardenas, eventually pulled Mason aside. "We've been digging through his microchip data. You're listed as his original handler, but he was transferred to a private security firm years ago." Mason frowned. "Private? You mean civilian contractors?" She nodded. "One of those third-party firms that buys retired K-9 South for surveillance work or property protection. It's common now, cheaper than training new dogs, less oversight." Mason's jaw tightened. "So what happened to him?" Dr. Cardenas sighed. "That part's unclear. Whoever last owned him hasn't responded. All we know is he wasn't turned into a shelter. He wasn't chipped as retired, he was dumped." The word hit Mason like a punch. He spent the next 3 days digging through records, calling government contacts, pushing through red tape. Most doors slammed shut. A few opened just enough to confirm what he feared. Ringo had been sold to a private firm in Houston, used for perimeter work at a high-risk facility, then let go after developing hip issues and a suspected heart murmur. No medical care, no retirement paperwork, no shelter notification. They'd simply released him into the streets. Disposal, one contact had muttered bitterly. "They call it natural attrition." Mason wanted to scream, but Ringo kept improving slowly. His appetite returned. His fur began to soften. The shaking subsided. And on the 5th morning, when Mason opened the clinic door, Ringo was sitting upright in the recovery room, tail thumping, ears alert. The entire staff stopped what they were doing. "You're gonna make me cry," one nurse whispered. Mason knelt, smiling through the tears in his own eyes. "Look at you," he murmured. "Still got fight in you, huh?" Ringo licked his hand. That night, after final clearance from the vet, Mason brought him home. Not to a military base, not to another handler, just home. He cleared out the living room, laid down rugs for traction, placed a bed by the fireplace, and let Ringo roam. At first, the shepherd moved like a ghost, quiet, slow, unsure if he belonged. But after a while, he made his way to the rug and curled up, sighing deeply, like the breath of someone who hadn't slept without fear in years. Mason sat beside him, not to pet, not to command, just to be there. The news broke 2 days later. A local reporter picked up the story, then a national one. Veteran reunites with K-9 left to die on streets. Photos surfaced. The image of Ringo curled up in Mason's arms went viral, and the question echoed everywhere. How did this happen? The contractor responsible issued a half-hearted apology. "We deeply regret the oversight." Mason didn't bother responding. He wasn't looking for apologies. He wanted accountability. So he gave the interview just one. And when the reporter asked him what it felt like to find his old partner in that condition, Mason didn't hesitate. "It felt like betrayal," he said. "Not just of him, of everything we say we stand for, because loyalty isn't supposed to be one way. He served this country with his body and his soul, and when he couldn't serve anymore, he wasn't retired, he was discarded." He paused, then added, "But here's the thing, he never blamed anyone, not even me. I looked in his eyes, and all I saw was trust. That's the kind of love we don't deserve, but it's the kind that can save us." The interview ended in silence. That night, as the fire crackled low, Mason sat on the floor next to Ringo's bed. He placed a hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm. "You came back to me," he whispered. "You never stopped being mine." And Ringo, in his own way, replied, with breath, with peace, with presence. Because some bonds are built not in words, but in the silence between war and home. And sometimes, when the world forgets, a soldier remembers. The media storm didn't last long, but the impact lingered. Mason turned down every follow-up interview after the first. Wasn't interested in attention-only justice. But the more he pulled back, the louder the public became. Photos of Ringo's fragile frame before recovery, side by side with his calmer, healthier self now, spread across veteran groups, animal rights networks, and military forums. The outcry built steadily, until someone from the Department of Defense called Mason directly, not a secretary, not a PR rep. "A Colonel Mason," the man said, voice tight, "I've read your report and seen the footage. I want you to know we're reviewing the adoption system. It shouldn't have happened." "Reviewing?" Mason replied coldly. "He nearly died, sir. There shouldn't be anything left to review." The colonel paused. "You're right. And ... we'd like your help in making sure it doesn't happen again." Mason didn't trust it. Not right away, but he agreed to fly to D.C. for one closed-door briefing, just to say what needed to be said face to face. He hated leaving Ringo behind, even for 2 days. Lydia, the vet, agreed to keep him. "He's healing fast," she told him, "but he waits by the door every evening. He knows you're coming back. That kind of memory doesn't fade." The Pentagon meeting was sterile. predictably quiet. Mason sat across from a panel of men and women in uniforms, badges, suits. He spoke plainly, without rehearsed statements or dramatics. He didn't need to exaggerate. The facts were enough. They trained him to run into gunfire, to search blind rooms, smell out explosives, detect snipers. He never once hesitated, Mason said. And when he got hurt, when age caught up to him, you didn't just retire him. You sold him to the highest bidder with no plan, no safety net, and no obligation to make sure he lived. That's not retirement, that's abandonment. There were some nods, some shameful silences, and then questions, good ones. For the first time, Mason felt the wall beginning to crack. But back in Oklahoma, something was happening no one expected. It was the third night without Mason when Lydia noticed a subtle change. Ringo hadn't eaten. He didn't pace, didn't whine. He simply stared at the door longer than usual, then curled up, quieter than before. When Lydia approached, he lifted his head, but the spark was dim. Later that evening, a young vet tech accidentally knocked over a metal pan. The sound sharp rattled through the hallway. Ringo jumped to his feet, chest heaving, eyes wide with confusion. He bolted to the corner of the room, cowering, teeth bared, but not at anyone, at the air. At a sound that shouldn't have meant danger anymore. Lydia rushed in. She didn't touch him. She just knelt close and began whispering the same things. Mason always said, "It's okay. You're safe. It's over." It took minutes for him to calm. When Mason returned the next morning, Ringo didn't run to him. He walked deliberate, steady, and placed his head into Mason's chest, not out of desperation, out of relief. "I wasn't sure if he'd hold on," Lydia admitted, "but he waited. He always waits for you." Mason held back tears. He always did, even when I didn't deserve it. In the weeks that followed, Mason went back to work, not military service, but something new. With the help of a few veterans organizations and support from the shelter community, he launched a project called the Forgotten Vests, a non-profit that tracked retired military and service dogs, offering medical support, safe retirements, and advocacy against the quiet practice of for-profit disposals. Ringo became the face of the campaign, not as a mascot, as a survivor, but not everyone welcomed the attention. One morning, Mason received an unmarked envelope, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, him and Ringo exiting the clinic. A message was scrawled across the bottom in red marker. "You should have let the mutt die. No one cares where old dogs go." Mason sat still for a long time, staring at the picture. Then he burned it. They reported it, of course. Local police brushed it off, anonymous. No fingerprints, no actionable threat. But Mason wasn't shaken. He'd seen worse, faced worse. The difference now was, he had nothing left to run from. Later that night, as the wind pressed against the windows and Ringo rested near the fireplace, Mason sat down on the floor beside him. "You know," he said softly, "when I found you, that day, I thought I was saving you, but I think you saved me again. I didn't realize how angry I still was. At the system, at myself, for leaving you behind." Ringo didn't move, but his tail brushed gently against the floor. "Now I see it. You weren't waiting for me out of pain. You waited because you still believed I'd come." Mason looked into those deep amber eyes, clouded just slightly with age but still so full of knowing. "I won't fail you again," he promised. "Not you, not the others." Ringo placed a paw across his knee, the same way he used to signal, clear during raids. It was small, but it was enough, because redemption doesn't come with medals. It comes with second chances. And this time, Mason wouldn't let go. Word about the Forgotten Vests spread faster than Mason had ever imagined. Within months, the organization had located over 30 retired service dogs, some in foster homes, others neglected in backyards or abandoned at underfunded shelters. Donations poured in, not from corporations or politicians, but from people, former handlers, retired soldiers, families of veterans who remembered what those dogs had meant. Still, for every success story, there was another case just like Ringo, and Mason carried the weight of each one. Ringo, meanwhile, had stabilized. His body was aging, his movement slower, but the fire in him never quite faded. On most mornings, Mason would find him in the same spot by the window, eyes alert, tail tapping lightly against the floor as if acknowledging another day they weren't promised. Sometimes they'd go for short walks through the wooded trail, behind Mason's house. Other days, Ringo would simply rest by the fireplace, dozing with his head against Mason's boot, as though the war was still echoing somewhere faintly in the distance, and only proximity could keep it at bay. But one morning, everything changed. Mason woke early, as always, but Ringo didn't come to the door when he called. Panic prickled under his skin. He found him curled on his bed, breathing, shallow eyes, barely open, a puddle of vomit nearby. Mason rushed to his side, checking his pulse, his gums, every instinct kicking in at once. He called Lydia, voice trembling, and within minutes was racing toward the clinic. The waiting room was too quiet. The clock ticked too loudly. Mason sat hunched in a chair, Ringo's leash still in his hand, even though the dog was already being worked on in the back. Lydia came out 30 minutes later, eyes heavy. "It's his heart," she said softly. "The murmur we suspected, it's worsened." He's in cardiac distress. Mason felt something fracture inside him. Can you fix it? We're going to try, she said. But Mason ... This may to be the last time he has the strength to fight. He nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Hours passed by. Evening. Ringo stabilized palely. He was placed on oxygen and sedatives, monitored around the clock. Mason refused to leave the room. He sat beside him all night, whispering stories he never told anyone else. About their first mission together. About the time they got caught in a flood zone in Kandahar and Ringo pulled a trapped boy from a collapsed house. About the way he used to curl up by Mason's cat when nightmares came and stay there, quiet, unmoving, until sleep returned. I never told you this, Mason said, his voice cracking. But after I got discharged, I stopped believing in most things. Country, command, all of it. But I never stopped believing in you. Ringo didn't respond, but his paw twitched, just slightly, and Mason knew he was still there, still listening. The next day, while Ringo remained under observation, Mason received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a whistleblower, an exemplary from the same private firm that had once adopted Ringo. She had seen the news, followed the Foundation's efforts, and finally decided to speak up. Her voice was trembling. There are more dogs, she said. Dozens, maybe hundreds, kept in storage yards, barely fed, some shipped overseas under fake contracts. They're not being retired, Mason. They're being recycled. Mason's stomach turned. She gave names, locations, records. Wanted to help before, she added, but no one would listen. They will now, Mason promised. I'll make sure of it. That night he filed a full report to the DOD and the press. He released photos, documents, first-hand testimony, and though it meant putting a target on his own back again, Mason no longer cared. If speaking the truth put him at risk, so be it. He was no longer afraid, because Ringo had taught him how to stand even when broken. 3 days later, Ringo woke up, barely able to sit, but eyes open, focused. He licked Mason's wrist weakly, then rested his head on his arm. It was all Mason needed. You're still with me, he said. That's all I need. He brought him home a week later, this time knowing it might be the last time, but it wasn't a farewell. It was gratitude. Ringo spent his final days on soft blankets under warm light, surrounded by the scent of pine and peace. No commands, no expectations, just rest. And every evening Mason would sit beside him and say the same thing. You kept me alive. Let me do the same for you. And Ringo would blink, slow and sure, as if agreeing to that truth. Then, one morning he didn't rise. Mason found him still, peaceful, breathless, but not gone. Because some beings don't truly leave. They remain. In the quiet, in the air, in every lesson carved beneath the skin. The next week, the Forgotten Vests received its first federal funding grant. A congressional investigation was opened into the handling of retired military dogs. Public outcry forced several contractors to release animals into care. And at the heart of it all was Ringo, not just a soldier's dog, not just a survivor, but a symbol. They buried him beneath a tree behind Mason's house. A simple marker, no flowers, just a brass tag from his first collar, and a line that read, Ringo. He never failed the mission, even when the mission failed him. And from that day on, whenever Mason spoke to new handlers, he ended with one quiet truth. You're their whole world. They don't forget, so make damn sure you remember. The winter after Ringo passed was the quietest Mason had ever known. The trail behind the house stayed untouched, the dog bed by the fire undisturbed, and the sound of claws on hardwood, a sound he never realized he loved, was gone. He didn't try to replace it. He didn't need another dog. Ringo had never been a pet. He had been a piece of Mason's soul that had taken shape beside him in the desert and never left. The silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. But grief, real grief, doesn't come all at once. It creeps in like fog, gentle, suffocating. Mason found himself staring at the leash still hanging on the back door, the paw print Lydia had taken before burial, the old tags that now rested in a small glass box on his mantel. What surprised him most was how much he missed the weight of Ringo's presence, even when the dog had said nothing. Even in his final days, Ringo's silence had never felt hollow. It had felt whole. Months passed, and the Forgotten Vests continued to grow. The non-profit was now nationwide. More than 70 retired K-9 South had been rescued, rehomed, or medically treated through their work. New branches opened in cities where military dogs were most often released into civilian care. Mason traveled less, but advised constantly on adoption, legislation, even training reform. His quiet anger had turned into motion. Purpose. He didn't speak of Ringo much unless asked, but when he did, he always began the same way. He never quit on me, even when he should have. Then, one spring morning, a letter arrived. It wasn't official. No seal, just a plain white envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman named Clara Reyes. She lived 3 states away and had recently taken in a retired detection dog named Ajax, another Malinois. The note was short. He's older, doesn't trust people, refuses to eat when anyone watches. I know I'm not doing it right, but I heard what you did, and I thought maybe you could help. Mason didn't hesitate. He packed a bag, loaded up his truck, and drove through the night. He didn't bring anything but his duffel, a folder of notes, and Ringo's collar. not because he intended to leave it but because carrying it gave him something to hold when the ache rose too quickly. When he arrived, Clara met him outside, wiping her hands on her jeans. She looked tired but hopeful. "He won't come out of the corner," she said quietly. "He hasn't since he got here. It's like he's waiting for someone else." Mason entered the house without speaking. He found Ajax exactly as described in the far corner of the laundry room, curled against the wall, eyes watching but unmoving. Mason didn't crouch, he didn't call. He just sat across the room, opened his duffel, and slowly placed Ringo's collar between them. Ajax stiffened. Then, after nearly 5 full minutes, he lifted his head and sniffed the air. He crept forward inch by inch until his nose touched the worn brass tag. Then he did something Mason hadn't expected. He sat not like a dog waiting for orders, like a soldier recognizing another's legacy. "I knew he had fight in him," Clara whispered from behind the door. Mason smiled. "They all do, they just need someone who sees it." He stayed 3 days. Didn't train Ajax, didn't push. He just taught Clara how to listen, to let silence do the work, to sit in stillness long enough that the dog began to believe no threat was coming. On the last day, as Mason packed, Clara handed him a small photo. Ajax curled up on the couch, tongue half out, finally asleep. "He's home," she said. Mason took the picture, but his voice caught in his throat. He only managed to nod. Back home, the trail behind the house began to change, not with a new dog, but with new steps. Veterans started visiting former handlers, widows, sons of soldiers. They walked it, sat on the bench by Ringo's tree, left small tokens, collar tags, patches, folded notes, sealed in plastic. Mason never asked them to come. They came because something in Ringo's story still echoed, because every handler carried one truth they didn't speak out loud, that the dogs didn't just work for us, they waited for us every day, in sandstorms and barracks and base camps and hospital beds. They waited through fear and pain and abandonment, and even when left behind. They remembered years later when Mason was asked to speak at a military ceremony honoring service animals. He kept it short. He didn't read a speech. He didn't wear a uniform. He held up Ringo's collar and said, "Some of them gave their lives. Some of them lost them slowly. But all of them waited. The least we can do is show up when they do." The room stayed quiet for a long time, and when he stepped down, a young Marine whispered, "I have one still waiting for me." Mason nodded. "Then you know what to do." He returned home that night and sat under the tree, the one where Ringo rested. The leaves moved softly in the wind. The bench creaked beside him. In his chest, the ache had never fully gone, but it had changed. It was no longer pain. It was memory. It was the echo of claws on tile, the weight of a head in his lap, the silence of a promise kept. And in that silence, Mason smiled, because he knew somewhere out there, another handler was waking up, another dog was being rescued, another bond was forming that would one day be tested. And if they were lucky, if they held on through the worst of it, they would know what he knew now, that love like this doesn't fade, it just waits for the next one to find it.